The wind was the first thing she learned about the high plains. It was not a sound, but a presence. A relentless, scouring force that stripped the warmth from a body and the hope from a soul. It moaned through the ill-fitting planks of the cookhouse, carrying with it the fine, gray dust that settled on everything, a constant grit in the mouth and a film over the eyes. Alara felt as though she had been breathing it in for a lifetime, though it had only been a month since the wagon left her at the remote outpost of Blackwater Creek. She was the new cook, a position taken out of a desperation so keen it had its own bitter taste. A widow at 19 with nothing to her name but a quiet disposition and hands raw from lye soap. The men who passed through the cookhouse were like the land itself. Hard, weathered, and unforgiving. They spoke little to her, their gazes either sliding past her, as if she were a piece of furniture, or lingering with a crude assessment that made her shrink further into herself. The foreman, Riggs, a man with a barrel chest and a voice like stones grinding together, had made his opinion of her clear from the start. "Can't have a timid mouse feeding a crew of wolves," he'd grumbled to the station master, loud enough for her to hear. "She'll be scared of her own shadow by week's end." The shame had burned hot in her cheeks, but she had said nothing. Her silence was a shield she had carried since childhood, and she did not know how to set it down. So she cooked, she cleaned, and she faded into the splintered wood background, her world shrinking to the heat of the cast-iron stove and the rhythmic chop of a knife on a worn cutting board. It was in this self-imposed invisibility that she first truly saw him. His name was Caleb. The other hands called him the Ghost, and the name fit. He moved with a heavy quietness that was different from her own. Hers was born of fear. His seemed carved from some deep, internal granite. He was tall and lean, with shoulders that spoke of immense strength, but he held himself with a rigid stillness, as if bracing against a blow only he could see coming. He never joined the boisterous, rough talk at the long table, instead taking his plate to a corner bench, his back to the wall. The men gave him a wide berth, their taunts about him always uttered when he was out of earshot. They saw a sullen, brooding man, a loner who courted his own misery. Alara saw something else. Her grandmother, a woman whose hands always smelled of chamomile and earth, had taught her to look for the things left unsaid, to read the stories told by the body. And Caleb's body told a desperate tale. It began with his hands. She noticed it one evening as he reached for the salt cellar. A tremor, fine as a hummingbird's wing, that he immediately stilled by clenching his fist. She saw it again days later as he mended a bridle, his fingers struggling with the small buckle before he disguised the awkwardness by wiping his hands on his trousers. The other men saw a moment of clumsiness. Alara saw a battle being fought and lost. Then there was the color of his skin. Beneath the deep, sun-brown tint of a man who lived outdoors, there was a persistent, unhealthy pallor, a grayish cast that clung to the hollows of his cheeks and the skin around his eyes. He coughed sometimes, a dry, stifled sound he would smother in the crook of his arm, his shoulders hunching against a private pain. Riggs would yell at him for lazing about, for his pace slowing on the long cattle drives. "Got ghosts in your boots, Caleb?" He'd bellow with a laugh that held no humor. The men would join in, their laughter echoing across the dusty corral. Caleb never responded. He would just set his jaw, a muscle twitching in his cheek, and the shadows in his dark eyes would deepen until they seemed to hold all the sorrow of the vast, empty sky. They saw weakness, a man succumbing to some inner demon. Alara watched him brace a hand against the rough-hewn wall of the barn when he thought no one was looking. His head bowed for a long moment, and she saw not a demon, but a disease. It was a language of suffering she was beginning to understand, a silent litany of symptoms that everyone else, in their noise and their haste, had chosen to ignore completely. Her own fear for her precarious position was a constant, cold knot in her stomach, but a new fear, sharp and urgent, began to grow alongside it. A fear for the silent, haunted man who was fading away in plain sight. Their interactions were islands of silence in an ocean of noise. She began leaving a tin mug of hot, thin coffee on the edge of the stove long after the other men had gone, knowing he was often the last one in from the stables. The first time, he hesitated, his gaze flickering towards her for a bare second before he took the mug and retreated to his corner. He did not thank her, but the next morning, a small, neat stack of perfectly split kindling lay beside the cookhouse door, saving her the arduous task of wielding the axe in the pre-dawn chill. A silent trade had been made. A language was being built, one gesture at a time. She would sometimes find a single, perfect prairie wildflower, its purple petals a shock of color against the drab landscape, laid carefully on the windowsill. In return, she made sure the heel of the bread, the part she knew he preferred for its thick crust, was always saved for his plate. This quiet barter did little to soothe the growing alarm inside her. Caleb's condition was worsening, the signs becoming more difficult for him to conceal. One afternoon, while hauling a heavy saddle from the tack room, he stumbled. It was not a simple trip. His leg seemed to give way entirely. He caught himself on a post, his face contorting in a brief spasm of agony before the mask of indifference slammed back into place. Riggs saw it. Drunk before noon, Caleb? Or are you just that useless now? The foreman's voice was a whip crack. Caleb said nothing, merely straightened up, hefted the saddle with a visible effort that made his shoulders tremble, and walked on. Alara, watching from the cookhouse doorway, felt her own breath catch. She saw the sheen of cold sweat on his brow, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped the leather. It wasn't drink. It was a body in revolt. Her mind sifted through her grandmother's teachings, the remembered scent of dried herbs and the low murmur of her voice explaining the signs of sickness. The body keeps its own secrets, Alara, but it always whispers the truth. She thought of fevers, of lung sickness, of the wasting diseases that could hollow a man out from the inside. But none of them quite fit. The tremor, the bouts of dazing confusion, the deep, localized pain he tried so hard to hide. It was something else, something insidious. It reminded her of a story her grandmother had told of a soldier returned from the war, seemingly whole, who carried a piece of lead buried deep in his flesh. It hadn't killed him outright, but had soured him from within, poisoning his blood slowly, until his strength failed and his mind grew clouded. A hidden wound. The thought took root, a cold certainty that settled deep in her bones. She began to watch him with a new intensity, her shy gaze now a diagnostic tool. She noticed the way he favored his left side, the subtle stiffness in his gait, how he would unconsciously press a hand to his ribs when he thought himself unobserved. The pieces were falling into place, forming a terrifying mosaic. One evening, a sudden downpour sent the men running for cover. In the chaos, a spooked horse reared near the barn door. Caleb, moving to calm it, was a fraction too slow. His reaction was sluggish, his movements uncoordinated. Another hand, a young man named Finn, yanked him back just as the hooves came crashing down. For a single unguarded second, as Caleb leaned against the barn wall, his face ashen, Alara saw raw fear in his eyes. It was the terrified look of a man trapped inside a failing body, a prisoner of his own flesh. Then, as always, the mask returned. He pushed himself off the wall, nodded curtly at Finn, and disappeared into the gloom of the barn. The incident was dismissed as a near miss, another sign of Caleb's bad luck or drunkenness. But Alara knew she had just witnessed a man nearly die, not from the horse, but from the sickness that was stealing his life, one tremor, one stumble, one stolen breath at a time. The whispers of his body had become a scream, and she was the only one listening. The sky had been a bruised purple for days, the air heavy and still with the promise of violence. Then the blizzard came. It descended without warning, a solid wall of white that erased the world, swallowing the horizon and muffling all sounds save for the shrieking of the wind. The ranch was plunged into an isolated, frozen twilight. The men, trapped and restless, huddled around the stove in the main bunkhouse, their rough energy curdling into arguments and anxious silence. The cold was a physical entity, seeping through the walls, turning every breath to frost. For Alara, the storm was an external manifestation of the terror that had been building inside her. They were cut off. No doctor, no help, Nothing but the howling wind and the dwindling supplies. It was on the second day of the blizzard that it happened. Riggs sent Caleb to the barn to check on the livestock, a task that required a perilous journey clinging to the guide rope strung between the buildings. An hour passed, then two. The men grumbled about him, speculating that he'd found a hidden bottle and drunk himself into a stupor. Riggs's face was a mask of thunderous impatience. "Useless," he snarled, spitting into the fire. "I'll fetch the fool myself." But before he could move, Finn burst through the door, his face caked in snow, his eyes wide. "It's Caleb," he gasped, his words tumbling out between ragged breaths. "He's down. In the barn. I think he's dying." The men scrambled into their coats, their petty grievances forgotten in the face of true crisis. Alara, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest, pulled her thin shawl tighter and followed them. A small shadow swallowed by the storm. They found him in the freezing hayloft, collapsed beside a stall. He was shivering violently, his skin unnaturally pale and slick with a feverish sweat that was already beginning to freeze. His eyes were open but saw nothing, glazed with delirium as he muttered broken, senseless words. Riggs took one look and sneered, the sound ugly in the frozen air. "Drunk. The fool's finally done it. Leave him. We'll drag him out when the storm breaks, if the cold don't take him first." He made a move to turn away, to abandon him to the elements. Something inside Alara, a part of her that had been dormant and silent for her entire life, finally broke free. It was not a roar, but a quiet, unyielding force. No, the word was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the wind's howl with the sharp edge of steel. Every man turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. Alara stepped forward, placing her small frame between Riggs and Caleb's prone body. She met the foreman's furious gaze without flinching. Her hands were trembling, but her voice, when she spoke again, was steady. "He is not drunk. He is sick." Riggs let out a harsh bark of laughter. "Sick? That man's been sick in the head since the day he got here. Now get out of the way, girl, before you catch your death." He reached for her to push her aside. She did not move. She simply stood her ground, her eyes holding his. In that moment, she was no longer the timid mouse. The fear was still there, a cold tide licking at her feet, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective certainty. For the first time, Riggs saw not a shy girl, but an immovable object. He faltered, his hand dropping to his side. He scoffed, a dismissive, angry sound. "Fine," he spat. "He's your dead weight. Don't come crying to me when you're hauling a corpse." He turned and stormed out of the barn, the other men following in his wake, their uncertainty and fear making them cruel. Alara was left alone with Caleb in the vast, echoing cold. The moment they were gone, she knelt beside him, her practical nature taking over. With Finn's reluctant help, they managed to half-carry, half-drag Caleb through the blinding snow to the relative warmth of her small room off the cookhouse. She barred the door against the storm and the world, creating a tiny sanctuary of flickering lamplight. There, she did what she had been needing to do for weeks. Gently, she unbuttoned his coarse shirt. Her breath hitched. There, on his left side, just over his ribs, was a puckered, angry-looking scar, the flesh around it a deep purplish red and hot to the touch. It was old, but the skin was drawn tight over a hard, unyielding knot beneath. A hidden wound. Her grandmother's story echoed in her mind. No longer a tale, but a terrible, living truth. The poison had festered for years, and now it was claiming him. The fever was his body's last, desperate battle, a fire that would either purge the sickness or consume him completely. The blizzard raged for 3 days, and for 3 days Alara waged her own silent war. Her small room became a sick room, an apothecary, a battlefield. The world shrank to the size of the narrow cot where Caleb lay, his body a furnace of fever. The howling of the wind was the only sound besides his ragged breathing and the soft clink of a spoon against a ceramic bowl. She worked tirelessly, moving with a quiet efficiency that belied the storm within her. She was no longer just a cook. She was a healer, calling upon a deep well of ancestral knowledge she hadn't known she possessed. She crushed mustard seeds and onions, mixing them into a pungent poultice that she spread on a clean cloth and laid against his chest and the inflamed wound. Its sharp heat meant to draw out the deeper fire of the infection. She boiled strips of willow bark, the bitter tea a potent weapon against the fever, and forced it, drop by drop, between his cracked lips. Sleep was a luxury she could not afford. She sat vigil in a wooden chair, the lamplight carving deep shadows under her eyes, her senses attuned to every shift in his breathing, every twitch of his muscles. In his delirium, the granite walls he had built around himself crumbled. He spoke of battlefields, of smoke and fire, of a name, Samuel, repeated over and over like a prayer of grief. She listened to the ghosts that haunted him, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth, offering a silent compassion that asked for nothing in return. On the second night, the infection peaked. His breathing grew shallow. His skin took on a deathly gray sheen, and for a terrifying hour, she thought she had lost him. She cleansed the wound again, her hands steady despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. She pressed on the hard flesh around it, a desperate, painful act, and was rewarded with a release of heat and poison that smelled of decay. It was a grim, harrowing victory, fought alone in the heart of the storm. Then, on the third morning, as the first pale, watery light of dawn filtered through the grime on her window, a change occurred. The wind's shriek softened to a mournful sigh, and in the sudden, profound silence, she heard it. The sound of Caleb's breathing, no longer a ragged gasp, but a slow, even rhythm. The fever had broken. His skin was cool to the touch. She slumped back in her chair, an exhaustion so deep it was painful washing over her. A short while later, his eyes fluttered open. They were clear. The haunted, fever-bright glaze was gone. He looked around the small room, his gaze confused, before it settled on her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the weariness etched into her face. He tried to speak, his voice a dry rasp. Why? It was a single word, holding a universe of questions. Alara simply dipped a cloth in a bowl of clean water and moistened his lips. You needed help, she said softly. The space between them filled with an understanding far deeper than words. He closed his eyes, not in delirium, but in the first true rest he had known in years. When the storm finally passed, it left behind a world transformed, buried under a blanket of pristine, silent snow. The change was not just in the landscape. When Alara emerged from her room, the men in the cookhouse fell silent. They looked from her to the closed door of her room and back again. There were no more snide remarks, no dismissive glances. In their place was a grudging, astonished respect. Riggs, standing by the stove, simply nodded at her, a gesture that was both an apology and an admission of defeat. She had done what none of them could or would do. The timid mouse was gone. In her place stood a woman of quiet, unshakable strength. Caleb's recovery was slow, a gradual rebuilding of a body long besieged. He spent days in the small cot, regaining his strength under her watchful care. The silence between them remained, but it had changed. It was no longer a void, but a shared space, comfortable and profound. He would watch her as she worked, his eyes following her with a quiet intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in her life. Once he was strong enough, he began to help her. He split wood, hauled water, and repaired the loose board by the door, his movements becoming surer each day. The tremor in his hands was gone. The shadows still lingered in his eyes, but they were memories now, not active hauntings. One afternoon, he spoke her name for the first time. Alara. The sound of it in his low, rough voice was startlingly intimate. He held out a small, intricately carved bird, whittled from a piece of scrap wood. Its wings were outstretched as if in flight. She took it, her fingers brushing his. It was not a thank you. It was a promise. A beginning. They stood together by the window weeks later, looking out as the snow finally melted, revealing the first green shoots of spring on the high plains. The wind still blew, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like a breath, He was no longer the ghost, a man defined by his past, and she was no longer the shy girl, invisible in her silence. They were two survivors, bound by a shared ordeal, who had discovered that the most powerful voice is not the one that shouts, but the one that chooses to see, to listen, and to act when no one else will.